Thank you. Ms Copsey.
Thank you, Acting President. I rise to speak on the Corrections Amendment Bill 2026 on behalf of the Greens and to say unequivocally that we will be opposing this bill. This is a horrendous bill. This is a shameful bill that this government is bringing before the Parliament today, and I would like to say I'm surprised, but at this point I am not. This government has shown consistent disregard for human rights when it comes to its justice policy, and this is just the latest failure from the Andrews, Allen, Carroll Labor government, who have decided that they do not care about evidence-based justice responses. And as a community, we are all paying the price for that failure of courage, political will and sense. This bill raises a very simple but an appalling question. Can a government pursue a mass incarceration agenda, drive more people into prison and onto remand, and then respond to the pressure it's created itself by taking away basic human rights? Well, the Greens say no. Section 47 of the Corrections Act currently provides that a person in prison who is not ordinarily engaged in outdoor work has the right to spend at least 1 hour each day in the open air, weather permitting. This is known as the Mandela Principles. It is a fundamental tenet of humane incarceration of people accepted globally. This bill attempts to make that right conditional. Rights are not conditional, rights exist. So this bill attempts to strip that right away from people incarcerated in Victorian jails, depending on whether it is reasonably practicable, having regard to operational considerations. Those considerations are very broad. They include management, good order and security of a prison, and the safety and welfare of prisoners. But it's not an exhaustive list either. And the government's own explanatory memorandum to this bill makes clear that this power is intended not to operate just in short-term emergencies, but on, quote, an ongoing basis or for extended periods of time, end quote. So, to be very clear about what this Labor government is putting before the Parliament today, we are being asked to weaken the rights of people in prison to get a measly 1 hour a day in the open air. Being able to see the sky, to breathe fresh air, this is not a luxury or some special privilege. It is one of the most basic minimum conditions of humane treatment. The historical context here also is quite extraordinary. I've mentioned that this bill falls foul of established international practice in relation to guaranteeing minimum standards for human rights. It also takes us back in history, in Victorian history. The National Trust's history of Old Melbourne Jail described the brutal conditions of 19th century model prison systems. People could be locked alone in tiny cells for up to 23 hours a day, and they wore silence masks when they left their cells. But even prisoners in solitary confinement in Victorian-era prisons were allowed 1 hour of exercise each day in the fresh air. Nearly 2 centuries later, this Labor government is asking Parliament to remove that right. We should be moving away from the cruelty of Victorian-era imprisonment, not finding fresh legal mechanisms to reproduce it in 2026. Now, of course, prisons do have genuine operational needs. They need to manage genuine emergencies, security incidents and immediate risks to safety. Of course, the state needs to do that, and it needs to do that in a humane and legal fashion if it takes the extraordinary measures of sentencing people, depriving them of their liberty and sentencing them to carceral sentences. The responsibility that goes with that is to design a correction system that can function without breaching people's rights on the regular, on the daily. That's what's happening under Victoria's Labor government as we speak. This bill expressly contemplates denying open-air access for extended and ongoing periods because of this Labor government's failure in the correction system, because of ongoing operational constraints that they know about, that they have allowed to fester. The broader context here also really matters. This government has spent the past 2 years weakening and messing up Victoria's bail laws undoing progressive reforms that it embarked on in the first period of the Parliament, making it more difficult for people to remain in the community with access to support systems, to family networks, to education and work opportunities while they're awaiting trial. And subsequently, they have increased with their own policies, pressure on our prisons, pressure on our police stations and cells, and on the remand system. And we know that these choices, these policy choices that this Labor government has made, will disproportionately and are disproportionately affecting First Nations people, women, children, people with disability, people who are experiencing poverty, and people with mental illness and disability. The answer to this overcrowded, under-resourced, inadequately functional prison system cannot be to lower the standard of human rights. You can't make political choices that put more people behind bars and then tell those people that the state can no longer guarantee the most basic conditions of humane detention. A person does not lose their rights because they are in prison. They do not lose their dignity because they're on remand. And I've been really disturbed by some of the statements in the chamber today which indicate just a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of incarceration, comparing it to public health orders, trivialises the gravity of what the state does in sentencing people. We should also remember that many people who are being held, particularly on remand, people are held by the state before they have been sentenced. They are detained and held and experience deprivations on occasion in justified circumstances because of external factors that they can be held before sentence. But there are people in the system who are not yet convicted, and there's been real glossing over and conflation of those two situations by some of the contributions that I've heard in this debate today. People are actually innocent until they are convicted of crimes. The Victorian Aboriginal Legal Service has been really unequivocal about what the operational considerations referred to in this bill mean in practice. They are an experienced stakeholder who are trying to support people who are being sucked into and criminalised by Victoria's justice policies day in, day out. And Vals tells my office that for more than 18 months, Corrections Victoria has used operational considerations as an excuse to impose rolling lockdowns, which are actually to do with staffing shortages. Vals has clients that have reported extended confinement in cells and disrupted access to support programs, beneficial support programs, to their visits with external people, including medical and legal appointments, cultural support, and social and emotional wellbeing and mental health services. Vals has reported that this current practice by the Corrections Department under this Labor government has led to an alarming increase in self-harm incidents and suicide attempts during these lockdowns. And we have seen deaths in custody continue under this government. The deaths in custody that this government was warned were an ongoing risk and a direct risk and consequence of their policy choices. What does the government do to try and correct this situation? Well, it doesn't try and improve the system and the treatment of people within there. Now the government actually wants to put those same words, operational considerations, into legislation as a legitimate basis for limiting people's access to open air, to fresh air, for 1 hour a day. Vals warns us, quote, "The right to open air, often only granted for an hour a day, can be life-saving. It is unconscionable to strip that away." This warning needs to be taken extremely seriously. Fresh air and sunlight are not luxuries, they're kind of necessary things for humans, for us to function well. And if we are serious about the rehabilitative intent of our sentencing practices, they are fundamental. You can't expect people to thrive and to recover and to move towards positive life outcomes if you are torturing them in jail. You can't expect people to thrive in that circumstance. Vals is warning us that you cannot expect people to survive in that circumstance, and that's what this Labor government is putting before the chamber with this bill. The bill, of course, is precipitated by the Supreme Court's decision in Murogi. The court found that certain enclosed rear courtyards attached to cells in high security and management units at the Metropolitan Remand Centre and Barwon Prison didn't satisfy the statutory requirement that prisoners have access to the open air. The proper response to a court finding like this would be to admit the fault, to recognise the inhumane conditions that your government has created in detention, and to act to rectify those. But that's not what this Labor government does. They are not here to take responsibility for the situation they've created. Shamefully, they have turned around and are trying to strip away people's human rights and change the law in a manner that will probably affect large numbers, if not every incarcerated person in the state. And worse, the bill retrospectively tries to protect the state from monetary liability for its past failures to meet the open air entitlement. That will apply even where legal proceedings have already commenced. So, provided they haven't been finally determined, when this provision, should it pass the Parliament, comes into operation, this government is telling people, the law gives you this right, our charter guarantees you this right, the Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities that the Victorian government is so proud of, that it's about celebrating its 20th anniversary this week, I might add. We're going to take that right away from you. We're going to change the rules. You went to court to enforce it while it was legally enforceable, but we've changed the rules on you and the consequences retrospectively, so you can't receive justice and you can't receive damages. Parliament should always, as a principle, be very cautious about retrospective legislation, but especially, I would argue, where it's designed to protect the state from the consequences of its own failures. The caution, I would add, should be even greater where people who are affected are prisoners. Often, people in this situation may not be sympathetic targets of public empathy and sympathy, but they are in a profoundly unequal relationship with the state. They are in one of the most unequal relationships with the state that a citizen of Victoria can find themselves. And the government is seeking to hit people while they're down and take away the most fundamental meagre rights that they should be entitled to. The bill also contains a second retrospective measure buried in there, which was added in the Assembly, validating actions that were taken by the Department of Justice and Community Safety advanced practitioners between April 2024 and May 2026, where some actions were taken without the required delegations being in place. So again, this is less serious than the substantive content of the bill, but it's another administrative failure by the state that is being sought to be repaired retrospectively through the legislation. The government's own statement of compatibility on this bill says that this bill is in part incompatible with human rights. It identifies the protections that are violated as the protection against cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment and the right to humane treatment when deprived of liberty as rights that are being limited. So normally you would think that that would make the government stop and ask if it's got the balance right, but instead this bill expressly excludes the relevant provisions of the Charter. And then it goes further than an ordinary charter override. In fact, the explanatory memorandum confirms that the usual 5-year expiry on this override doesn't apply. So the government is, with this bill, seeking to grant this exemption to operate indefinitely, and that's extraordinary. I think it's particularly important in that context that Ms Payne's amendment relating to a statutory review be accepted today. The Greens will be supporting the amendments brought forward by Legalise, and I think that this facet of the bill makes that an extremely important amendment. The Charter in Victoria exists precisely because governments under pressure do have to limit people's rights through legislation, and the Charter sets out what those rights should be and the calculus that we should apply when seeking to limit those rights. And governments under pressure can make choices of administrative convenience and political convenience, I would add, over the rights of marginalised people. Rights matter most when respecting them is difficult or politically inconvenient, actually. There are few groups whose rights are easier to politically disregard, particularly in this state's media environment, I acknowledge that, than people in prison. But there's another egregious aspect of this bill that I want to turn to now, and that's what this bill does to the state's newly proclaimed relationship with treaty and the First Peoples Assembly and Galangwal. The government's own treaty compatibility statement acknowledges that Aboriginal people may be disproportionately affected by this bill, particularly Aboriginal people held in separation and custody. And it accepts that restricting open-air access may compound the unacceptable disadvantage experienced by Aboriginal people, and concludes that aspects of this bill are incompatible with treaty objectives of addressing the ongoing injustices of colonisation and ensuring the equal enjoyment of human rights and fundamental freedoms by First Peoples. Remarkably, that treaty statement also admits that Galangwal was not given the opportunity to advise on the open-air provisions before this legislation was introduced. The government says there was simply not time. Now, that's bad enough that that work wasn't done before this bill was brought to this place. Galangwal has now spoken. For the first time, the First Peoples Assembly has exercised its powers under the Statewide Treaty Act to make a formal submission to the government on this legislation, and its message cannot be clearer. It says, withdraw this bill. Galangwal says the bill is inconsistent with the spirit and intent of the Statewide Treaty, and it will disproportionately affect First Nations peoples. Co-Chair Jaron Murray-Jackson has said, quote, "This bill is not in the spirit of treaty, nor is it compatible with the Statewide Treaty Act," end quote. The Assembly has also pointed directly to the Uruk Commission's recommendations that Victoria implement the United Nations minimum standards on solitary confinement and properly fund and operate prisons so that the prolonged lockdowns for administrative or management reasons are ended. This bill just takes us in the opposite direction of that. It tries to paper over and excuse the failures of the state rather than fix them. Galangwal says that this bill would move in precisely the opposite direction. It entrenches those practices under the language of, quote, operational considerations. So this is a real test of what these new treaty powers mean in practice. This is a test of the government's words versus its actions. Under Section 83 of the Statewide Treaty Act, the Minister for Corrections must respond to Galangwal's submission within 60 days. And I would argue that that's a perfectly reasonable thing. It's something that the state should have factored in to the timeframe for bringing this bill to Parliament. And it's something that's still within the state's power to action. Pause this bill, take the time to engage with Galangwal and give them the response that they are entitled to. But instead of pausing the debate, considering this first formal intervention and responding in good faith, the government has pressed ahead today with the bill. They commenced that the statement was delivered in the last 48 hours, but the government pressed ahead, started debate on this bill last night, is pressing ahead today. In the same week that it's pulling its own signature legislation for work from home. It's completely within the government's power to pause this bill, and in fact they are doing that with another thing that they said that they were committed to, but they've had industry pressure, they've had business group pressure on the work from home bill, so they're choosing to pause that. Yeah, thank you, Ms Purcell. You can work from home, but you can't breathe air. You can respond to business group pressure, but you won't respond to Galangwal asking you to withdraw this bill. It says everything about the continuing priorities of this Labor government. So at an absolute minimum, we would have expected the government to delay debate while it considered Gelling-Weil's call. Treaty can't be something that this government celebrates ceremonially and then disregards when First Peoples turn around and use the powers that you gave them in good faith. VAL's CEO, Nerita Waite, has said that this state desperately needs to confront systemic over-policing, racial discrimination, Aboriginal deaths in custody and the shamefully high incarceration of Aboriginal people. VAL says that the government must authentically engage with Gelling-Weil through treaty, and the Greens wholeheartedly support this call. We won't be supporting this bill should the government press ahead with it, and I echo and endorse the comments of Gelling-Weil that the government should withdraw it. This bill shouldn't proceed. If the government is concerned about pressure on the prison system, there are actually answers available, and it's the failure of the government to seriously engage with these policy solutions that is reprehensible. They should be reversing their punitive bail agenda. They should implement Pockham's law. The Greens have steadfastly sought to amend the regressive bail laws that this government has brought. There should be a single unacceptable risk test for bail. We should get rid of the offences, the bail offences that are funneling people into the system where they will now be routinely dehumanised and tortured for low-level offences. Offences that may not even result in a carceral sentence. We need to invest in housing, in healthcare. We need to properly back our community legal centres. We need to invest in drug and alcohol support. We need to invest in mental health support. And we need to properly back First Nations-led justice responses. Each year, I have put in budget submissions begging for the government to invest in the proven work that VALS is doing. These services work, they're there, they're ready to scale up, but the government chooses to funnel money, billions of dollars, into prisons, into policing, rather than doing what works. And then they can't even manage the system that they create. We need to properly staff prisons. If you're going to pursue this agenda, then you need to recognise the consequences that come with that, the burdens on the courts, police and our corrections system. The Greens would say you need to expand genuine alternatives to custody that give people access to better pathways rather than institutionalising and further criminalising people. We need desperately to reduce the huge number of people being warehoused on remand in this state. We are going backwards on this. We are going backwards under a Labor government. The government should not create greater pressure within the correction system and then try to legislate away the rights that become inconvenient for them to deliver as a result. The state has an obligation to run prisons safely. It also has an obligation to run them humanely. I would say it's something that the state should be proud to do. This is a marker of whether or not we are actually a civilised society, this bill. Under Labor, the answer is no. 1 hour in the open air. It is an extraordinarily low bar and they can't get over it. This Parliament should not let them get away with it. We should not let them lower the bar further. The Greens oppose this bill and I have put some amendments to colleagues that we will seek to add to this bill today. I ask that those be circulated now and I'll briefly speak to those.
Thank you. If the amendments can be circulated. Ms Copsey, you can continue.
Thank you, Acting President. So these amendments relate to another ongoing travesty under the Andrews, Allen, Carroll Labor government, which is the practice of decanting. My amendments take the opportunity to address this other serious human rights problem which is persisting in Victoria's corrections system, and that's the prolonged detention of people in police cells, in police jails. Earlier this year, the Greens introduced the Corrections Amendment, Stop the Legal Loophole, Better Rights in Police Custody Bill 2026. And that bill sought to stop the practice known as decanting and to strengthen basic protections for people who are being held routinely in police cells as a result of the overcrowding and under-resourcing of Victoria's justice system under Labor. So these amendments are narrower than what was introduced in that bill. They take two important elements of it. The first is that these establish in legislation an upper limit of 14 days for a person to be detained in a police jail, except in circumstances of extraordinary emergency. It's my understanding that individual jails may have a lower maximum time that's gazetted. This amendment is not intended to make all of them automatically 14. It sets an upper limit of 14 days maximum in police jails. The Greens would like to see that lowered, actually. We don't think that police cells are designed to hold people for prolonged periods, and we don't think that 14 days is a good time for someone to spend in one of these facilities. But we want to legislate an upper limit because we find that in practice, even that generous time frame is being exceeded in Victoria regularly. The second part of this amendment makes it clear that transferring a person from one police jail to another will not reset the 14-day time period. Time already spent in police jails counts towards the overall 14-day limit. The Greens would like to see, I think together with police and other stakeholders, we would like to actually see in practice a lower limit. We've advocated for 7 days previously as the upper limit. We're putting 14 days before the Parliament. We think that in most circumstances that is probably one that's already sought to be met and tried to be met by various actors in the justice system, and it should not go longer than that. Like, this is, again, a low bar. Police cells are designed for short-term detention. They're not prisons, they're not correctional facilities, and they don't have the facilities, staffing or services necessary to hold people safely for weeks at a time. And it matters because people are currently being moved between police stations, sometimes over enormous distances. And let's be crystal clear, moving someone from one inadequate police cell to another doesn't solve the problem, it just resets an administrative clock. People held in police jails can spend 23 hours in a day in a cell, and maybe after today that'll be 24. They have poorer access to healthcare, lawyers and visits from family, and they don't have programs and supports that are available in regular correctional facilities. People have been transported hundreds of kilometres from their families, communities and legal support teams. Some people have even served entire terms in police cells. Duty solicitors tell my team that they are regularly losing people in the police cell system. Neither the person's family or solicitors know where the person's being held at a particular time, and therefore they cannot drop off essential medicines, basic things like a change of clothes, change of underwear for someone being detained by the state. They can't have necessary legal appointments, and they tell us it's only a matter of time before these conditions lead to a death. For Aboriginal people in particular, this is extraordinarily dangerous. Val's represented a Gunai Kurnai man earlier this year who had spent 26 days in police custody in these inadequate conditions. He'd been moved between police stations at one point around 200 kilometres away from his family and community. Val's reported that during this period he experienced serious medical problems requiring 5 ambulance attendances and 4 hospitalisations, and that access to his family and medication was restricted. Decanting is being used to extend detention beyond existing gazetted 14-day limits, and Val's has caused for this practice to end. Victoria Police has itself acknowledged that police cells are inappropriate for prolonged detention and previously sought agreement with Corrections Victoria to reduce the transfer period from 14 days to 7. Police should be doing police work. They shouldn't be required to operate an overflow default prison system because this government changed the bail laws without ensuring that the corrections system could cope with the entirely predictable increase in people on remand. I asked the government about what modelling they'd done when we were doing the bail bills. They should have seen this coming. Our amendments are modest. They don't pretend that it will solve this broader crisis or guarantee all of the rights that people should have in custody, but they do put in a real limit into the law, and they close this loophole that is allowing the limit to be circumvented by moving a person from station to station. We think that these amendments simply bring into practice what the rules should be. These amendments, I note, require an instruction motion, and I would ask all members of the chamber, when we come to consider this in committee, that they support the instruction motion regardless of their position on the amendments. I will have more to say in committee, and I'll leave my comments there.
Thank you.